Imagine standing at the edge of the known world, your boots stained with the dust of 3 continents, your name whispered with reverence and terror from the shores of the Mediterranean to the deep valleys of the Hindu Kush. You are 22 years old. You are undefeated. Every army that has dared to block your path has been shattered into dust. Ask yourself this: what drives a mortal man to march 22,000 miles not to conquer for gold or land, but to chase the literal horizon until his own body gives out? Today, we dive into the epic, blood-soaked, and breathtakingly fast rise and fall of Alexander the Great. By the end of this video, you will see how a volatile prince with a mythical bloodline built an empire spanning millions of square kilometers, only for it to tear itself apart in a storm of betrayal, paranoia, and mysterious death before he even turned 33. Stay tuned, because right after this, we are going to look at the exact moment his tactical. As a teenager, Alexander was handed over to the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, Aristotle. For 3 years, in a quiet sanctuary of stone and trees, Aristotle fed the young prince a diet of biology, medicine, poetry, and philosophy. Alexander slept with a dagger and a copy of Homer's Iliad beneath his pillow, annotating the epic tale of Achilles as if it were a military manual. He viewed himself not as a mere Greek king, but as a living demigod destined to outshine his literary ancestors. Legends are forged in youth, and Alexander's legend began with a massive, untamable black stallion named Bucephalus. When the horse was brought to King Philip, it bucked and reared at everyone, terrified of its own shadow. The king, frustrated, ordered the beast taken away, but teenage Alexander stepped forward, pointing out a simple truth that everyone else had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow dancing in the bright sun. With quiet confidence, Alexander grabbed the reins, turned the animal's head toward the sun so it could no longer see its shadow, and leaped onto its back. He rode it smoothly across the royal courtyard as the court watched in stunned silence. Philip, tears of pride in his eyes, embraced his son and uttered words that would echo through history. "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." In 336 BC, the illusion of royal stability shattered. At a grand celebration in the royal theater of Aegae, King Philip II was assassinated by Pausanias of Orestis, one of his own bodyguards, driven by a personal grievance. Chaos erupted. Across the empire, subject tribes and conquered Greek city-states thought Macedon was finished. Rebellions flared up in Thrace, Illyria, and Athens. At just 20 years old, Alexander did not hesitate. Acting with ruthless lightning speed, he hunted down and executed every single co-conspirator and rival to the throne. Then, before the rest of the world could blink, he marched his elite cavalry south into Greece. The city of Thebes, which had dared to renounce Macedonian rule, found out the hard way what crossing Alexander meant. Alexander razed Thebes to the ground, slaughtering thousands and selling the survivors into slavery. He spared only the temples and the house of the ancient poet Pindar, sending a chilling message across the Mediterranean: submit or be erased from history. With Greece terrified into total submission, Alexander secured the supreme command of the Hellenic League. The domestic chessboard was cleared. Now, his eyes turned eastward, toward the ultimate prize, the colossal, fabulously wealthy Persian Empire, ruled by King Darius III. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led an army of roughly 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry across the narrow strait of the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was a monumental gamble. The Persian Empire was the global superpower of its day, stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, boasting endless reserves of gold, manpower, and veteran soldiers. Alexander, by contrast, had empty treasuries and barely enough supplies to last his men 30 days. As his flagship neared the Asian shore, Alexander threw his spear into the earth, leaping off the deck to claim the continent as spear won land. He visited the ruins of ancient Troy, sacrificing at the tomb of his idol, Achilles. He was enacting a grand historical drama, and the world was his stage. His first major test came at the river Granicus. Persian satraps had massed their forces on the steep, muddy opposite bank, waiting to butcher the Macedonians as they waded across. Most generals would have waited for dawn or sought a safer crossing. Alexander ordered an immediate, ferocious cavalry charge right into the teeth of the current. Fighting in the thick of the melee, his life was saved only at the last second by his loyal general Clitus the Black, who hacked off the arm of a Persian noble aiming a scimitar at Alexander's head. The Persian line shattered, and Asia Minor lay wide open. Realizing the danger, the great king of Persia, Darius III, decided to take command personally. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Darius assembled a massive army numbering over 100,000 men in a narrow coastal plain that neutralized their numerical advantage. Alexander spotted Darius across the battlefield sitting high on his royal chariot. Ignoring all tactical safety, Alexander formed his elite companion cavalry into a wedge and drove straight toward the Persian king like a thunderbolt. Panic seized Darius. True to his character, the Persian monarch turned his chariot and fled the field, abandoning his mother, wife, and children to Alexander's mercy. When Alexander entered the royal Persian tent, he did not loot or destroy. He treated Darius's captive family with exquisite royal courtesy, winning the loyalty of conquered peoples not just through the sword, but through calculated magnanimity. Rather than chasing Darius deeper into Asia, Alexander executed a brilliant strategic pivot. He turned south down the Phoenician coast to strip the Persian navy of its vital naval bases, securing his supply lines. Most cities surrendered without a fight, but the island city of Tyre, fortified behind massive 50-foot stone walls sitting half a mile out in the sea, defied him. They assumed they were completely safe. Alexander responded by constructing a monumental stone mole, a massive land bridge stretching across the open ocean, using the rubble of the old mainland city. When the Tyrians used fire ships to burn his siege towers, Alexander built bigger ones, mounted artillery on floating barges, and finally breached the ancient sea fortress in 332 BC. After a brutal 7-month siege, 2,000 Tyrian men were crucified along the shoreline as a warning to anyone else who dared resist the march of the Macedonian king. From Tyre, Alexander marched into Egypt. The Egyptians, who had long suffered under brutal Persian rule, welcomed him not as an invader, but as a liberator. The priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh and living incarnation of Amun-Ra. Deep in the western desert, Alexander made a grueling pilgrimage to the Oracle of Siwa. There, the high priest whispered a secret divine prophecy into Alexander's ear, confirming, at least in the king's mind, that he was indeed the son of Zeus. Before leaving Egypt, he traced out the foundations of a new coastal city on the edge of the Nile Delta, Alexandria, the first and greatest of many cities that would bear his name, destined to become the intellectual capital of the ancient world. With his flank secured, Alexander turned back inland to hunt down Darius once and for all. In October of 331 BC, the two forces collided at Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq. Darius had picked the terrain carefully, clearing a vast plain so his massive army of over 200,000 men, complete with scythed chariots and war elephants, could completely surround and crush the 40,000 Macedonians. On the eve of the battle, Alexander's veteran general Parmenion urged a surprise night attack. Alexander famously replied, "I will not steal my victory." When the battle commenced, the Persian lines stretched so wide that they threatened to encircle Alexander's flanks. Seeing a gap open up in the center of the Persian line as they shifted to counter his movement, Alexander seized the moment. He formed a giant wedge of cavalry, charged directly into the gap, and drove straight toward Darius's personal bodyguard. Darius panicked once more. Seeing the terrifying Macedonian king bearing down on him, the Persian king wheeled his horse around and fled for his life. Seeing their leader run, the Persian army collapsed into total rout. The Achaemenid Empire, the greatest superpower of the ancient world, was broken in a single afternoon. Alexander swept triumphantly into Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. The wealth captured here was beyond imagining. Thousands of talents of gold and silver coins piled so high that it took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry the royal treasury away. To celebrate his conquest, Alexander hosted a massive wine-soaked victory feast in the grand palace of Xerxes. Fueled by alcohol and egged on by an Athenian courtesan named Thais, the drunken conqueror did the unthinkable. He took a torch and set fire to the legendary palace of Persepolis, watching as centuries of Persian history, art, and architecture burned to the ground in an act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half prior. As the flames lit up the night sky, a sobering reality settled over Alexander. He was no longer just the king of Macedon. He was the great king of Asia, ruling over millions of subjects whose cultures, languages, and traditions were entirely foreign to his rough Macedonian soldiers. Cracks began to form within Alexander's inner circle. His hardened Macedonian generals, who viewed themselves as free companions of their king rather than groveling subjects, watched with growing horror as Alexander began adopting Persian court customs. He started wearing the flowing purple robes of Persian monarchs, surrounded himself with Eastern eunuchs, and demanded proskinesis, the traditional Persian custom of bowing down and kissing the ground or the king's hand. To the Greeks, this was blasphemy. Only the gods deserved such worship. To the Persians, it was simply how one treated a king. Paranoia crept into Alexander's brilliant mind. He began to suspect plots everywhere. In 330 BC, upon discovering a vague rumor of conspiracy, he ordered the execution of his loyal veteran general Philotas, and then sent assassins to murder Philotas's elderly father Parmenion, fearing revenge. The tipping point came during a drunken banquet in Maracanda in 328 BC. Heated arguments broke out over whether Alexander was taking too much personal credit and forgetting the Macedonian blood that built his throne. Cletus the Black, the very man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, furious and drunk, began openly berating the king, reminding him that he owed his crown to Macedonian soldiers. Blinded by a sudden rage, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and drove it straight through Cletus's chest. As the blood poured out and his oldest friend died on the floor, the alcoholic haze vanished. Alexander fell to his knees beside the corpse, weeping hysterically, refusing to eat or drink for 3 days, cursing himself as a murderer. The golden boy of Macedonia was beginning to fracture from the inside out. Driven by an insatiable restlessness that borders on madness, Alexander refused to stop. Having pacified the rugged mountain tribes of Bactria and Sogdiana, where he fell in love with and married the stunning Sogdian princess Roxana, he set his sights on the ultimate frontier, India. In 326 BC, Alexander crossed the rugged Hindu Kush mountains and invaded the Punjab region of the Indian subcontinent. His campaign here was brutal, fighting through torrential monsoon rains, dense jungles, and fierce local resistance. At the epic battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced his most terrifying enemy yet, King Porus, who deployed a massive line of armored war elephants. The giant beasts terrified the Macedonian horses and crushed their infantry lines. Using brilliant tactical footwork, Alexander split his forces under cover of a torrential thunderstorm, crossing the river unseen and outflanking the Indian army. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the Macedonian discipline won the day. When King Porus was brought before him, badly wounded, standing over 7 feet tall, Alexander asked him proudly how he wished to be treated. Porus replied without flinching, "Like a king." Impressed by his fierce courage, Alexander restored Porus to his throne as an ally, expanding his kingdom rather than destroying it. It was a rare moment of classical statesmanship in the middle of a brutal campaign. Alexander wanted to push further east. He wanted to cross the Ganges River, conquer the great Nanda Empire, and reach the mystical Great Outer Sea that he believed marked the absolute edge of the flat earth. He gathered his soldiers and gave an impassioned speech, urging them to march onward to eternal glory. Silence met his words. For 8 years, these men had marched over 22,000 miles. They were ragged, wounded. For 8 years, these men had marched over 22,000 miles. They were ragged, wounded, sick, wearing animal skins, their weapons blunted, their pockets heavy with gold they had no way to spend. Finally, a grizzled veteran stepped forward and spoke for the entire army. "King, it is time for a man to know when to stop. Look at us. Our hair is gray, our bodies are scarred, our families have forgotten us. Let us go home." Alexander stared at them in absolute disbelief. Furious and deeply wounded, he turned his back on them, retreated to his tent, and refused to come out for 3 days, waiting for them to beg him to change his mind. No one came. For the first time in his life, Alexander hit a wall he could not conquer, the collective human will of his own exhausted men. Defeated by the mutiny, Alexander wept, turned his army around, and began the long, agonizing march back toward the west, opting for a route that would punish his army for their rebellion. Or perhaps seeking to match the mythical failures of Cyrus the Great, Alexander led his men through the blistering, waterless wastes of the Gedrosian Desert in modern-day southern Pakistan. It was a catastrophic mistake. Blinding sandstorms, scorching temperatures, and flash floods swept through the camps. Thousands of soldiers, women and children died of thirst, heat exhaustion, and starvation. During the worst of the march, a group of scouts found a small trickle of muddy water in a helmet and brought it back to Alexander as a precious gift. Alexander took the helmet, looked at his parched, dying men staring at him with sunken eyes, and poured the water out onto the sand. "I will not drink," he said, "while my men go thirsty." That single gesture bought him the remaining loyalty of an army that would have otherwise murdered him in his sleep. By 323 BC, Alexander and the tattered remnants of his army finally reached Babylon, the city he intended to make the administrative capital of his universal empire. He was only 32 years old, yet his body was a map of destruction. He had been wounded multiple times, an arrow through his lung in India that nearly killed him, a sword blow to the head at the Granicus, a shattered ankle at Samarkand, alongside chronic malaria and heavy nightly bouts of drinking. In late May of 323 BC, after attending a massive, heavy drinking party hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa, Alexander suddenly collapsed with a violent fever. For 11 agonizing days, the fever raged. He lost the ability to speak, watching helplessly as his veteran soldiers filed past his bedside in absolute silence, weeping as they realized their living god was slipping away. When his generals finally gathered around his deathbed and asked him to whom he left his colossal empire, Alexander whispered his final, fateful words, "Toid kratisti," to the strongest. On June 10 or 11, 323 BC, the breathing stopped. The man who had conquered the known world was gone. Alexander never named a clear, stable successor. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and his generals were fiercely ambitious. The moment his body grew cold, his empire did not merely fracture. It exploded into a half-century of continuous civil war known as the Wars of the Diadochi. His mother Olympias, his wives Roxana and Stytira, his infant son Alexander IV, and his illegitimate son were all brutally murdered, hunted down by rival generals eager to carve up the spoils of world conquest. The great empire, held together solely by the magnetic terror and genius of one man, shattered into rival Hellenistic kingdoms ruled by his former bodyguards. Alexander the Great burned across the pages of history like a dying star. In barely 12 years of campaigning, he changed the cultural, political, and linguistic DNA of 3 Baltic continents, spreading Greek thought from the Nile to the Indus. Yet his life remains history's greatest cautionary tale about the dark side of boundless ambition. He conquered the entire world, but in the end he could not conquer his own rage, his own thirst for endless expansion, or the inevitable clock of mortality. He left behind a legacy of glory so blinding that 2,000 years later, leaders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte would visit his tomb, weeping with despair because they knew they would never measure up to the boy from Macedonia.